Section. The music that died in the dark. It was a gray and drizzling morning in October when I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself once again at Baker Street, summoned not by telegram nor urgent note, but by a peculiar silence that had filled my own rooms for the past 3 days. Holmes had been unusually absent from our mutual haunts, no sightings at the Turkish baths, no inquiries to his chemist on Wigmore Street, not even the faint scent of pipe smoke that often lingered mysteriously outside my practice. It was a silence that sang with foreboding, and I had learned long ago that when Sherlock Holmes grew quiet, it meant a storm was stirring in his brilliant mind. When I entered 221B, I was greeted by a sight both familiar and curious. Holmes stood at the window, one hand clasped behind his back, the other holding an open violin case. Inside, cradled in its velvet lining, was not his own instrument, but something older, richer in hue, its varnish glinting amber in the pale London light. "This," Holmes said without turning, "is a piece of history, Watson. A violin? Not just any violin." He finally turned, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar energy that often preceded the unraveling of some inscrutable mystery. "This is the Salieri Viotti, an Italian masterpiece thought to have been lost in the fire at Ravensden Abbey in 1817, and yet here it is intact in my possession. How did it come to you?" He placed the violin case on the settee and gestured for me to sit. I noticed for the first time that the hearth had not been lit. The air was chill, and the shadows seemed thicker than usual. Holmes began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. "3 nights ago," he began, "a young man by the name of Adalbert Grange came to me at midnight, no less utterly distraught. He is a violinist of some repute, though not yet well known outside of the upper echelons of London's classical scene. He was engaged to perform with the Montfort Quartet at the Albert Hall this coming Friday, but he arrived here claiming he could never play again. Some injury?" "Worse," Holmes said, pausing. "Terror. Grange claims to have been followed by a sound, no, not followed, haunted. A melody that would echo through his rooms when no one was present, always at the stroke of midnight. And not just any melody, Watson, a piece never performed publicly, never written down, known only to the late Maestro Santiago Bellini." I blinked. That would be impossible. Bellini died in Rome nearly 15 years ago. Indeed. And yet Grange swore he heard Bellini's Lamento da Notte, the lost sonata, the one he composed in secret during his final days, which he reportedly played only for a single pupil. And this pupil, Holmes gave me a thin smile, vanished. Grange heard it how? Through the walls of his flat on Rosemore Lane. He'd rise to investigate, no signs of life, no neighbors awake. The melody would stop the moment he opened the door. Twice he found his sheet music rearranged. On the 3rd night, he claims he blacked out entirely and awoke to find this violin, this Salieri Viotti, laid across his bed. A long silence followed. I admit to feeling a chill not born of the autumn weather. Holmes turned and plucked the instrument from its case, studying the scroll and bridge with delicate reverence. "Then," I said slowly, "Grange believes he is being what? Haunted? Warned? Or manipulated?" Holmes replied, placing the violin gently down. "Either someone is playing a cruel trick upon the young man, or he is at the center of something far more elaborate and dangerous. And why, come to You? He is convinced he is being driven mad, Holmes said simply. But in madness there is often method, and in method, he gestured to the violin, a mystery. There was a rap at the door just then. Mrs. Hudson, without knocking, ushered in a young woman in a dark claret coat, her expression tight with worry. She clutched a small black umbrella and had the look of someone used to rushing through the world unnoticed, but who had now, quite unwillingly, stepped into its center. "Miss Elowen Marr," Holmes said, rising. "Thank you for coming." She inclined her head, eyes darting between Holmes and myself. "You said it was urgent." "It is," Holmes said, motioning to the armchair by the fire. "Please sit." "I don't have much time," she replied, remaining on her feet. "I'm expected at rehearsal." "You are first violin for the Montfort Quartet," Holmes said, "and formerly, I believe, a student of Maestro Bellini." She stiffened, lips pressed into a line. "That's not public knowledge." "No," Holmes said, "but Grange spoke of you. He said you once performed the Lamento Damnat." "That's impossible," she snapped. "That piece was never played outside the walls of Bellini's villa. He composed it in secret." She stopped herself, suddenly aware of how much she had revealed. Holmes stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Yet you know its notes. You've heard it in your sleep, haven't you?" Miss Marr hesitated, and then her composure cracked, just for an instant. "He taught it to me when I was 17, but he swore me to silence. He said the piece was cursed." "A curious word for a rational man," I said. "He wasn't rational at the end," she whispered. "The night he died, he locked himself in the music room and played it over and over, as if trying to undo something. By morning, he was gone." Holmes folded his hands. "And now Grange hears the same music always at midnight." Miss Marr's eyes widened. "That's impossible." "Yet it happened, and this violin," Holmes gestured to it, "appeared soon after. I suspect it's a message." "A warning," she said, barely audible. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or an invitation." Another silence settled between us. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, pattering against the glass like fingers on a piano. "I must go," Miss Marr said. "But if you find anything, please come to me first. I don't know what's happening, but Adalbert, he's in danger." "Rest assured," Holmes said, his voice colder now, more focused. "I intend to know everything before the bell tolls again." She departed, leaving only the scent of lilac and fear behind. Holmes turned to me, eyes burning. "Something has returned from the past, Watson. A song no one should have remembered. Tonight we go to Rosemore Lane." And with that he plucked a single note on the Salieri viotti. It rang out, low and mournful, lingering far longer than it should have, as if the room itself refused to let the sound die. Section. The curious chambermaid and the wisteria clue expanded. It was a late April morning when we arrived at the Royal Kensington Hotel. The London air was cool and heavy with mist, the cobbled streets damp beneath our feet. A curtain of gray clouds blanketed the city, casting everything in a cold pallor. As we approached the grand entrance of the hotel, Holmes walked ahead of me with his usual brisk stride, his eyes roving across the building's exterior with meticulous focus. He seemed invigorated by the prospect of the case, as though its peculiarities provided some long-needed intellectual nourishment. The doorman, an elderly fellow with a regal posture and weathered face, greeted us with a curt nod and held open the glass-paneled doors. We stepped into the warmth of the foyer, where the faint aroma of polished mahogany, old cigars, and fading lily greeted us. Tall windows let in a pale light that glinted off the marble floor and a gilded chandelier. Above threw flickers of gold against the high ceiling. It was the kind of establishment that prided itself on quiet elegance, a haven for foreign dignitaries, visiting musicians, and London's affluent elite. We were met by Mr. Barnaby Quince, the hotel's manager, a nervous man of slight build, whose thinning hair was neatly combed and whose expression oscillated between professional poise and poorly concealed worry. His crimson waistcoat was straining at the buttons. "I cannot thank you enough for responding so promptly, Mr. Holmes," Quince said as he shook Holmes's hand fervently. "The entire staff is in quite a state. The disappearance of Signor Bellini has not only cast a shadow over our reputation, but is causing no small amount of alarm among our guests." Holmes gave a measured nod. "I take it that Scotland Yard has already been notified?" Yes. Inspector Lestrade was here earlier this morning," Quince replied, dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "He examined the room, asked a few questions, and left with little more than a shrug. He believes Bellini left of his own accord." "And you disagree?" "I do. Signor Bellini is a man of ritual. Breakfast at 7, a walk in the rose garden. At 8, practice from 9 until noon. He never misses rehearsals, and he would never leave behind his violin." Holmes's eyes sharpened at this last remark. "You mentioned on the telegram that the violin case was found with the instrument inside?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes, in perfect condition, leaning against the divan. I had our staff leave the room untouched, precisely as we found it." "Then let us begin there," Holmes said. We followed Quince up a grand staircase that split into twin curves at the landing, its brass banister gleaming under gaslight. Paintings of pastoral English countryside lined the walls, though their tranquillity did little to settle the sense of unease that clung to the air, like the lingering scent of tobacco. Room 412, located at the far end of the fourth-floor corridor, overlooked the hotel's manicured garden. The hallway itself was quiet, muffled by thick carpeting and adorned with sconces that flickered as though uncertain of their purpose. Mr. Quince unlocked the door and stepped aside to allow us entry. The room was elegantly appointed, but undisturbed, in a way that felt unnatural. A leather suitcase rested neatly on the luggage rack, its straps still buckled. The writing desk bore an open folio of musical scores, filled with scrawled notes and pencil annotations. Was folded on the end of the bed. On the knit-stand sat a glass of brandy, the amber liquid still clinging to the sides as if it had been freshly set down. Holmes's gaze moved across the room with surgical precision. He approached the divan, where a dark leather violin case leaned against the armrest. He opened it and inspected the instrument within, gently lifting it by the neck. His fingers moved over the varnished wood, examining the bridge and strings, then set it back inside. With a frown, he moved next to the windowsill, pressing his fingers lightly into the wood. He crouched to inspect the carpet near the door, and then returned to the desk, sniffing the brandy and lifting a corner of the music folio. "It seems tidy," I said. "Perhaps too tidy." "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "It is the sort of cleanliness one would expect after a performance, not before a sudden departure. He'd pointed to a faint smudge on the armrest of the divan, an almost imperceptible smear of white powder. "Talcum? I guess. Possibly," he replied, scraping a bit into a glass vial from his inner coat pocket. "But without perfume. Industrial, perhaps." A gentle knock at the door interrupted our inspection. Mr. Quince appeared in the doorway. Miss Agatha Ponsby, the chambermaid who discovered the disappearance. "Shall I send her in?" "Please do," said Holmes. Miss Ponsby stepped into the room hesitantly. She was a petite woman in her early 20s, with an upturned nose and a sort of complexion that suggested she seldom saw sunlight. Her hair was pinned in a tidy bun beneath her cap, and her eyes darted nervously around the room as if expecting to be scolded. "Miss Ponsby," Holmes said kindly, "I understand you were the first to discover the room in its current state." "Yes, sir," she replied, twisting her hands in her apron. "I came up just before 7 to collect the breakfast tray, but it was still outside the door. I knocked, and when there was no answer, I used my key to enter. That's when I saw the room like this. I thought maybe the senior had gone down early, but when I saw the violin was still here, well—" Her voice faltered. "Yes?" Holmes prompted. "I just knew something was wrong, sir. He always carried it, down to breakfast, even to the garden. He treated it like a part of himself." Holmes nodded. "Did you notice anything else unusual? A smell? Something out of place?" She wrinkled her nose. "There was a strange smell, sweet, like almonds and something floral, but faint. It disappeared after a minute." Holmes's brow lifted. "Almonds? Maybe. I can't be sure, sir." He exchanged a glance with me. "Curious. And have you seen anyone unfamiliar lurking about recently?" Miss Ponsby hesitated. "Well, there has been a woman, middle-aged, in gray. She's not a guest, I'm certain of that. Always hovering near the third-floor staircase around dusk. She wears a long veil and walks with a sort of stiff, hasty gait. When I see her, she turns and leaves." Holmes's expression hardened slightly. "Has Mr. Quince seen her?" I told him, but he didn't seem to think much of it. "You've done well to report this, Miss Ponsby," Holmes said, and her cheeks flushed pink with pride. When she had left, Holmes returned to the violin and lifted it again. He struck a note with a bow and frowned. "This is not the real instrument." "What?" I said. "But it bears his name, and the case a convincing counterfeit," Holmes replied. "The bridge is slightly off. The tone lacks warmth. Bellini's Stradivarius would never sound so wooden. Then someone has replaced it. Possibly the night of the disappearance, precisely." He turned toward the window, deep in thought. "Holmes, do you think this woman in gray could be connected?" "I do not believe in coincidences, Watson. A missing man, a counterfeit instrument, and a phantom woman hiding her face. We are being offered threads. Our task is to braid them into truth." Outside, the garden's wisteria vines trembled in a rising breeze. Holmes leaned forward, scanning the grounds below. "Come," he said suddenly. "There's more to be learned from the hotel's rose garden, and I suspect we are not the only ones seeking answers beneath its petals." And with that we followed Holmes down into the mist and toward the whispering vines that lined the path, below, unknowing that the game had only just begun. Section. Shadows in the garden. Garden at the rear of the Royal Kensington Hotel was a patch of cultivated tranquility tucked behind the bustle of Kensington Road. It stretched in perfect symmetry across a stone terrace and down a narrow lawn lined with tulip beds, clipped box hedges, and classical statues worn pale by London rain. It was, as the hotel's pamphlet declared, an oasis of civility and repose in the heart of the city. But to Holmes, as we descended the steps in silence, it was a chessboard. The mist from earlier had begun to lift, revealing speckled sunlight through the iron-spined trees. Holmes, with his long coat brushing against his boots, moved from pathway to pathway, his eyes scanning the gravel and garden walls with almost meditative calm. I watched him for a time before speaking. "You suspect the garden conceals more than just well-tended roses." "Everything conceals more than it reveals, Watson," he replied without looking back. "Especially when one believes they are staging a perfect illusion. Remember, the violin was not simply forgotten, it was substituted. A detail that reveals forethought, calculation, which means our missing man may have been removed through something equally premeditated." He knelt beside one of the trellised walkways. A fine footprint, half eroded, but still legible, lay embedded in a patch of damp soil just off the stone path. "A woman's boot," Holmes murmured. "Narrow arch, short stride. See here beside the wisteria." She waited, perhaps hidden by the blooms. The scent Miss Ponsonby noted likely originated from here. The fragrant trail of wisteria lingered thick in the air, sweet and almost dizzying. I looked to the vine-covered pergola that ran along the garden's edge. A place perfect for concealment. Holmes continued along the path until he reached a wrought-iron bench beneath an arbor. There he paused, crouched, and retrieved something with a gloved hand. "A brooch," he said, turning the object over. It was a delicate silver pin, shaped like a swallow in flight, missing its central stone. "Dropped in haste?" I ventured. "Or discarded deliberately," Holmes replied. "Every detail we find must be considered both accident and artifice until proven otherwise." He pocketed the pin and stood, his gaze traveling toward the rear gate of the garden. Beyond it, the alley behind the hotel opened onto Kensington Grove. "The woman Miss Ponsonby described," I said, "she could have entered from that gate unnoticed." "Indeed," Holmes said, and left again just as swiftly. Valina's morning walk always included this garden. She could have approached him here, under the veil of familiarity or falsehood. A friend? A phantom? We stood in silence for a moment. "Let us speak again with Mr. Quince," Holmes decided. "But this time I shall press on the matter of guests, staff, and any stranger who might have found her way into this establishment over the last week. I suspect we will find more than the missing musician if we dig with the right spade." We returned to the lobby, where Quince stood at the concierge desk, reviewing a guest ledger with trembling hands. "Mr. Quince," Holmes said, striding up. To him, "You've been accommodating thus far, but I must insist upon candor. Has anyone among your staff reported a suspicious guest, or more accurately, someone not listed in the registry loitering within the premises?" Quince blinked. Well, there were murmurs among the chambermaids about a veiled woman, but I dismissed them at first. We assumed she was the companion of Lady Velaston. The Dowager has peculiar visitors." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Lady Velaston. Would she be amenable to a visit?" "She is notoriously private, Mr. Holmes." "As am I," Holmes replied. But I am also stubborn." Quince gave a nervous cough. "I shall inquire on your behalf." Before he could leave, a young man entered the lobby, his dark hair tousled, his violin case tucked protectively beneath one arm. He wore a crushed velvet jacket and carried the air of someone who considered himself tragic and misunderstood. "Emilio Bellini," the young man announced with heavy Italian flourish. "I am the cousin of Signor Luca Bellini. I came as soon as I heard." Holmes tilted his head. "Cousin? You received news of his disappearance this morning?" "I was staying in Chelsea. A telegram came to me by way of his agent. I hurried here." Holmes stepped forward. "May I ask what brings you to London?" Emilio frowned. "I was meant to play second chair at Signor Bellini's debut performance at Her Majesty's Theatre. We were to perform together." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And now?" "Now I come only to find scandal." Emilio's eyes glittered. "And my cousin nowhere." There was something tense about him, too theatrical. His grief, though convincing, bordered on the performative. "Were you close with Signor Bellini?" Holmes asked. "We shared blood, but not always warmth," Emilio admitted. "He was a difficult man, but brilliant. He was the better musician, but I had my own admirers." Holmes nodded slowly. "Tell me, Signor Emilio, what violin do you carry?" "This?" Emilio lifted the case proudly. "A Guarneri, a gift from the Milan Conservatory." "Would you permit me to examine it?" Emilio hesitated. "I suppose." Holmes opened the case carefully and examined the instrument, his fingers dancing along its polished surface. "Genuine," he said softly, "and well kept. Did your cousin ever allow others to play his instrument?" "Never," Emilio replied firmly. "He said even tuning it was a sacrilege unless he did it himself." "Indeed?" Holmes snapped the case shut and handed it back. "Thank you." When Emilio departed, Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we must take advantage of her rare generosity." We followed Quince to the lift and ascended to the 5th floor, where the Lady Velaston suite occupied the corner room. A maid led us into a crimson drawing room, filled with bric-a-brac and the overwhelming scent of dried lavender. Lady Velaston reclined on a fainting couch, her features obscured beneath layers of lace and powder. She wore rings on every finger and a haughty expression that seemed carved in marble. Holmes bowed. "Your ladyship, forgive the intrusion." "I allow it only because I abhor disruption," she said. "And this business has disrupted my breakfast, my luncheon, and my foot bath." Holmes gave her a cordial smile. "I seek your insight, not your patience. Have you entertained a lady visitor in gray?" Veiled with a limp, Lady Velaston narrowed her eyes. "I entertained no one since 1892, especially not limping specters. Though," she trailed off, "my maid swore she saw a woman in gray slipping down the service staircase last week. But I dismissed it. I assumed it was some scandalous rendezvous with a bellboy." Holmes bowed again. "Thank you. You have helped more than you know." As we exited the suite, Holmes whispered, "Service staircase. A vital route between floors avoided by most guests. And yet our ghost in gray used it freely." "And likely knew it well," I added. "Precisely. Which means we're not seeking an intruder," Holmes said, eyes gleaming. "We're seeking someone who belongs." He quickened his step. "Back to the staff registry, Watson. It's time to look among the invisible people, the ones who see everything, hear everything, and yet are never seen. And so we descended, once more into the hotel's depths, the veil of music, mystery, and misdirection beginning to thin, but not yet break. Section. Among the invisible, the hotel's lower quarters possessed an entirely different atmosphere from the velvet elegance above. Gone were the marble floors and oil paintings here. The air was tinged with the smell of polished boiled potatoes and blacking wax. The narrow corridors of the servants' wing buzzed with industry and indifference. The clatter of trays, the hiss of steam from the laundry, and the distant hum of gossip formed an unseen but ever-present orchestra. Holmes moved briskly through the passages, his steps purposeful and eyes alert. Watson and I followed closely, noting the sidelong glances of maids and footmen as we passed. It was not every day, I imagine, that Sherlock Holmes came to interrogate the invisible workforce of a grand hotel. I've always said, Holmes muttered as he turned a corner, that it is not the guests who know the secrets of a place, but those who scrub its floors and press its linens. We arrived at the steward's office, a cramped nook lined with ledgers and rotas. A heavy-set man in a wine-stained waistcoat sat behind the desk, hunched over the weekly duty chart. "Mr. Needham, I presume?" Holmes said, drawing his full. "Height." The steward looked up, squinting. "That's me." "And you are?" "Sherlock Holmes." Needham blinked. "Oh, right, the one poking about the disappearance. They said you'd come. And you've had no thoughts to share until now?" "I don't meddle in high society drama, sir. I keep the pots boiling and the bed linen rotated. But if there's something to be done, I'll do it." Holmes's smile was thin. "Excellent. I need your full staff registry, particularly of those working this past fortnight. Any names that have appeared suddenly or departed without notice should be highlighted." Needham pulled a dog-eared ledger from beneath a stack and opened it with a crack. "You'll want this page, sir. Lists all the scullery maids, parlor staff, kitchen boys. We've had one or two changes lately. A chambermaid by the name of Mary Letchley quit last Thursday. No notice, just up and gone. A pity good with brass." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Did she limp?" Needham paused. "She did favor one leg. Had a weak ankle, she said, but she was quiet. Kept to herself. Where was her lodging? 2 blocks away. A boarding house on Shelley Mews." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, take that address down. We shall pay Miss Letchley a visit shortly." Needham cleared his throat. "There's more. Not sure if it matters, but one of the bellboys, young Edwin Rook, hasn't shown up since Sunday. Was he involved with this Letchley girl? Possibly. You know how these things go in servant halls? Flowers on trays and whispered nonsense. And stairwells, but I'd wager something startled him off." Holmes nodded, then moved to the service staircase Lady Velaston had mentioned. We ascended quietly, Holmes brushing his fingers against the handrail, eyes scanning for disturbances. "Observe," he said, halting halfway up and pointing to a cluster of faint scratches on the paint. "A violin case dragged here too large. For a simple handbag, too cumbersome for grace. So our mysterious woman used this route to remove Bellini's instrument?" I asked. "Or to replace it with a counterfeit," Holmes replied. "Recall the woman in gray was seen descending this stairwell. If she knew the hotel's layout and if she was indeed a former or current staff member, she could have done. So without arousing suspicion, we reached the third floor and emerged onto a quieter hallway. At its end stood a linen closet, and beside it a narrow staff room. Holmes ducked inside and emerged with a bellboy's cap. Edwin Rook, he sighed, inspecting the inside. Initials sewn here in thread. Left in haste or discarded deliberately? He turned to me. Watson, I do believe we are chasing two rabbits, but perhaps they share the same warren. Back in the lobby, Holmes requested a cab. To Shelley Mews, he instructed the driver as we climbed in. Time to meet the vanished maid. Shelley. Mews proved to be a crooked lane of narrow brick buildings, each hosting 4 to 6 lodgers at a time. A tangle of washing lines and coal smoke drifted above. We found the landlady, a pinched-nosed woman with red hands and a fondness for kerosene lamps, outside her stoop. Mary Letchley, she said, adjusting her shawl. Moved out Sunday morning. Paid up through the week, which was unlike her. Said she had family in Portsmouth. Packed 1 bag. No trunk. Left behind a pair of boots and an old coat. May we see the room? Holmes asked. She hesitated. You're not with the constables? Not yet, Holmes said. She led us up 2 flights to a small, stuffy chamber, barely large enough for a bed and washstand. The room was bare, save for a square of dust on the floorboards, where a trunk had once stood. Holmes moved with deliberate grace, studying the windowsill, the drawer, the bed frame. Then he paused by the hearth. There, he said. Inside the cold grate sat a scattering of gray ash, atop which a scrap of charred paper clung to the brick. Holmes retrieved it carefully with tweezers. It was a scrap of sheet music, still bearing the unmistakable curve of staves and a legible note, Allegro vivace in G major. The tempo marking matches Bellini's signature piece. Holmes murmured. She burned his music, I whispered. Or a copy of it, Holmes replied. But why destroy music unless it bore something damning? He turned the paper gently, revealing the corner of a wax seal barely touched by flame. The symbol, a stylized letter V within a lyre, was just visible. I've seen this before, Holmes said grimly. It is the insignia of the Virtuosi Society, a private musical circle, highly selective and deeply political. Bellini once attempted to join. He was refused. And this Letchley woman? Perhaps not just a maid, perhaps a failed pupil, or a discarded protege. We left the boarding house and walked in silence for a time. Holmes's expression darkened. This is no longer a case of a vanished violinist, Watson. It is a symphony of jealousy, obscured identity, and carefully orchestrated revenge. And I suspect the next note will not be played in allegro, but in something much more grave. We returned to Baker Street that evening, our minds brimming with connections yet unconfirmed. Holmes retreated into his violin playing, stroking the strings and minor harmonics, while I pored over my notes. As the fire dimmed and the city outside settled into silence, Holmes finally spoke. There is a shadow behind every performer, Watson, and sometimes that shadow plays a note louder than the stage ever permits. Section: A note beneath the silence, the morning after our return from Shelley Mews, dawn gray and windswept, with a drizzle pattering against the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes had not slept. He sat in the armchair by the hearth, fingers steepled and gaze fixed upon the glowing coals, as though within the flickering embers lay some hidden solution to our elusive puzzle. I, meanwhile, had been reviewing our notes and compiling a list of connections: Bellini's disappearance, the mysterious woman in gray, Mary Letchley's sudden departure, the link to the Virtuosi Society, and the presence of a burned sheet of music marked with their sigil. Holmes, I ventured, setting aside my notebook, if Mary Letchley was connected to Bellini and the Virtuosi Society, what motive might she have had to? Not she alone, Watson, Holmes interrupted, barely turning his head. That is the error we must avoid. In all likelihood, she was a pawn in a larger composition. I suspect Bellini's disappearance is not the climax, but merely a modulation, one that will shift key soon. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Delivered not 5 minutes ago. Mr. Holmes, she said, handing him the slip of yellow paper. Holmes opened it and scanned its contents. His eyebrows arched ever so slightly. From Lestrade. He murmured, "He's found Edwin Rook, the missing bellboy." "Alive?" I asked, rising. "Yes, and in rather pitiable condition." Holmes stood and reached for his coat. "He's at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, Ward B. They found him. Unconscious near the Thames, pockets emptied, coat worn, with no memory of the past 2 days. Curious timing, wouldn't you say?" "More than curious," I said. "Suspicious?" The hospital, cool and disinfected, welcomed us with the dull echo of footsteps and the scent of antiseptic. We found Inspector Lestrade waiting outside a curtained bed. "Bit of luck," he greeted us gruffly. Dock workers spotted the lad wandering half-conscious near Limehouse. "We brought him in last night." Holmes lifted the curtain and stepped inside. Edwin Rook, barely 16, lay propped against pillows, a bandage over one brow, and his face pale beneath a mop of red hair. "Mr. Holmes?" he croaked. "Yes, Edwin. No need for alarm. We only wish to know what happened." The boy blinked, struggling to focus. I don't remember much. I was on shift Sunday night. That's when it started. Lady Velaston had gone to the ballroom, and I was taking towels up to the 3rd floor. Someone grabbed me from behind hand over my mouth, smelled like medicine. Chloroform, maybe. Then nothing until I woke up near the river. Do you recall what your assailant looked like? He shook his head weakly. Didn't see, but I remember something music. Just before I blacked out, someone was humming a lullaby or something soft like a cradle song. Holmes straightened, a flash of recognition in his eyes. Thank you, Edwin. You've been most helpful. Outside, Lestrade scratched his chin. Well, that's a bit of color, but it doesn't get us much closer to Bellini, does it? On the contrary, said Holmes, stepping into the sunlight, it gets us closer to our conductor. We rode in a hansom cab back to Baker Street. Holmes unusually quiet. A lullaby, he said finally. Watson, do you recall Signor Bellini's most recent composition? I blinked. The Nocturne in A minor? Precisely. Subtitled Nina Nana, an Italian Lullaby. It was to premiere next week. Curious that young Rook heard something like it before losing consciousness. You think Bellini was there? No, Holmes said. I think someone was using Bellini's music to soothe the boy into unconsciousness. It implies familiarity and intent. We returned to our sitting room just as a carriage pulled up outside. A tall, severe man in a brown topcoat stepped out, flanked by two porters carrying crates. He knocked sharply on our door. "Sherlock Holmes?" the man inquired. "Yes." "I am Felix Dorian, solicitor for the estate of Signor Luca Bellini. Per the maestro's request, should he be absent for more than 48 hours under suspicious circumstances, I am to deliver these to your residence." Holmes frowned. "What do they contain?" "Correspondence, personal journals, and musical manuscripts. All sealed, save one letter, marked for your eyes only." Holmes signed the ledger and ushered the crates inside. As the porters departed, he slit open the sealed envelope with a letter opener. He read silently for several minutes, eyes dancing across the page, then handed it to me without a word. I read, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Should this reach you, I fear I am in grave danger. For several months now, I have been receiving threats, unsigned notes, warning me not to perform the nocturne I've written. It is a composition dear to me, not simply for its melodies, but for its message. It was inspired by someone I once taught, a brilliant young musician whose career I inadvertently damaged by refusing a recommendation to the Virtuosi Society. I suspect this individual, or one acting on their behalf, has orchestrated a plot against me. If you are reading this, I ask only one thing. Find the truth behind the silence. Luca Bellini P.S. The answer may lie not in the music I played, but in the one I did not. I looked up. He knew someone meant to silence him. Yes, Holmes said, and he suspected the culprit stemmed from his past, perhaps a former pupil, one who saw Bellini as a gatekeeper barring them from recognition. Mary Letchley? I asked. She's a piece of the puzzle, but not the linchpin. Remember, Watson Bellini wrote of someone he taught. Mary was a maid posing as a chambermaid, but there was also the mention of a musical circle, of one rejected. Holmes opened the crate and sifted through the papers until he found a folder marked Conservatory, 1891. Inside were programs, lecture notes, and attendance sheets. "There," he said, pointing to a name, "Agatha Verrilli." I squinted. "Didn't Lady Velaston mention her? A protege turned recluse." Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, and a former pupil of Bellini. A woman known for talent, but rumored to have a temper and connections to the virtuosi. She disappeared from public life years ago. But what if she didn't disappear? What if she simply changed her identity? To whom? That, Watson," Holmes said, "is what we must uncover next." He stood and grabbed his coat once more. "To the Royal Conservatory. If we are to find our vanished violinist, we must trace the last echoes of those he once silenced." Section: Shadows in the Conservatory. Royal Conservatory of London rose behind tall iron gates, like a citadel of high art, its facade of ivy-clad stone. Elegant arched windows and colonnaded entry hall gave the impression of an institution, too dignified to ever be touched by scandal. Yet Holmes and I knew better than to trust appearances. Within those marble walls, ambition and rivalry often played more dissonant chords than any symphony dot as we passed through the great doors. The scent of rosin and old wood filled the air, mingled with faint echoes of string quartets rehearsing. In distant rooms, a young clerk, spectacled and tight-lipped, approached as we entered. "I am Sherlock Holmes. Holmes said without preamble. "We wish to review archival student records from the year 1891, specifically those pertaining to Senior Luca Bellini's tutelage." The clerk's brow furrowed. "Access to student files is generally reserved." Holmes flashed a card from his coat pocket. "A letter of temporary authority," he said, "signed by Sir Reginald Mortlake, Lord Commissioner of the Board of Arts. Shall we?" The clerk blinked at the seal, then nodded stiffly. "Of course. Follow me." We were led down a long corridor flanked with oil portraits of notable alumni. At the far end, in a quiet records room, the clerk fetched 3 bound ledgers and laid them before us. "Please return them to the main desk when finished," he said, then departed. Holmes opened the ledger marked Matriculations, 1890 to 1893, and turned the pages with delicate precision. "Here," he murmured, tapping a name with his finger, "Agatha Virelli. Enrolled autumn term, 1890. Composition and performance. Primary instructor, Luca Bellini. She had received high honors in theory and technique, but in her second year a single note was scrawled across the margin in different ink. Withdrawn from. Society endorsement. Cited for disciplinary infraction. Recommendation withheld. O.B. That must have been a devastating blow," I said. "The Virtuosi Society selects only the most promising candidates. To be denied a recommendation by Bellini would have marked her as undesirable." Holmes nodded, and judging by the tone of Bellini's letter to me, he believed this slight, however justified, may have come back to haunt him. He closed the ledger. "Let us now examine the present." We made our way back to the front desk. "Do you maintain records of visiting instructors or guest performers?" Holmes asked. The clerk hesitated. "Yes, though some older records were transferred to the upper archive." "Hasn't Agatha Virelli ever returned to teach, perform, or consult here in any capacity in the past 10 years? The clerk flipped through a leather-bound register, running his finger down a column. After a pause, he frowned. "Nothing under Virelli. But there is an Agatha Velton who gave a seminar last winter on Romantic period instrumentation." "Velton," Holmes repeated. "A subtle pseudonym, close enough to recall the original for those who look hard, far enough to remain unnoticed." "She left a business card," the clerk offered. "Something about private instruction." Holmes took the card offered to him. I peered over his shoulder. "Agatha Velton Private Musical Tutorship. Violin and Theory 12 Billion, Langham Lane. Highgate Quiet. Address, the kind meant for privacy." "Thank you," Holmes said. "You've been most obliging." On our way out, Holmes paused beneath a bronze bust of an older composer. "I begin to perceive the shape of the melody," he said quietly. We left the conservatory and boarded a hansom bound for Highgate. Holmes fell silent, absorbed in thought. I could sense the threads were knitting together in his mind, yet he was not ready to share the tapestry. Langham Lane proved to be a tree-lined street with modest houses shaded by thick, swaying oaks. Number 12B was a narrow building set back slightly from the road, its paint beginning to peel. A brass plate beside the door read simply, "Miss Velton, music by appointment." Holmes rapped smartly with the handle of his cane. After a long pause, the door opened. A woman of striking appearance stood framed in the doorway. She had severe features, soft only by the deep intelligence in her dark eyes. Her hair, iron gray and swept into a tight chignon, contrasted sharply with the pale olive skin of her face. "Yes?" she said crisply. "Good afternoon," Holmes began. "We are seeking a former pupil of Luca Bellini. Your name appeared in a list of his prize students." She studied us closely, her gaze unwavering. "You must be mistaken. Am I? You never studied at the Royal Conservatory? Never performed under your former name Virelli?" Something flickered in her expression, quickly masked. "I do not know what you mean. Now, if you'll excuse me." Holmes blocked the door with his cane. "We're investigating the disappearance of Signor Bellini. His final letter identified you as someone of interest." Her breath caught. I saw her jaw tighten. "I have not seen Luca in years." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet he believed someone who once studied under him had returned to extract." Her breath caught. I saw her jaw tighten. "I have not seen Luca in years." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And yet he believed someone who once studied under him had returned to extract revenge for a past grievance. Miss Virelli or Velton your presence in London, your musical instruction, and your proximity to Violinist circle coincide with too many elements to be coincidental." "I have done nothing wrong," she said through gritted teeth. "He ruined me. There are better ways to address injustice than silence and threats," Holmes said gently. Her defiance wavered. Her gaze dropped. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He humiliated me, stripped me of everything. I was nothing without his approval. When I returned to London, I merely wanted to prove I had value. I never laid a hand on him." "Then perhaps," Holmes said, "you know who did?" She looked up sharply. "I know someone who hated him even more than I did," she said. "A former colleague, cellist. They were once rivals for a virtuosi scholarship. Luca secured it. The other was left behind. I saw him at a gathering last month. Milo Travers." I blinked. "But Travers has been retired for years. He lives in Suffolk." "Not any longer," she said. "He's returned to London. He joined the Virtuosi Advisory Board last summer. I saw him in the crowd when Bellini performed at the Queen's Hall. He didn't clap." Holmes straightened. A silence more deafening than applause. We took our leave from Miss Velton with a promise not to reveal her involvement publicly, and Holmes seemed satisfied for the moment, but his brow was deeply furrowed as we walked. "Travers," he muttered. "A name I should have considered earlier. If he has indeed returned and aligned himself with the society." I glanced at him. "Do you believe Travers is behind the abduction?" "If Miss Velton speaks the truth, he had motive. Opportunity remains to be proved. But one thing is certain, this mystery grows darker the closer we approach its heart." Just then, a carriage thundered past us in the opposite direction. Holmes stopped in his tracks, staring after it. Inside, seated behind the glass, was a man with long white hair and a dark velvet cloak. His gaze met Holmes's for the briefest of seconds. He vanished around the corner. Holmes's lips tightened. "Watson," he said, "I believe the final act approaches, and we must be ready when the curtain rises." Section: The Ghost at Queen's Hall. It was early evening when we returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps casting elongated shadows across the thoroughfare. Holmes had said little during our journey from Highgate. He had instead folded himself into silence, his gaze drawn inward, fingers drumming restlessly on his thigh like a violinist tapping out a silent rhythm. I knew better than to interrupt such a reverie. Once within the familiar confines of our sitting room, Holmes tossed his coat aside and stood before the fireplace, staring into the embers. "Milo Travers," he said suddenly, as if finishing a conversation with himself. "A man once celebrated as the rising star of the cello, then cast adrift when Bellini claimed the virtuosi laurels in '86. His compositional ambitions failed to materialize. His pupils left him. His performances grew fewer. The perfect recipe for resentment." I nodded, settling into my chair with a notebook. "And now he resurfaces just as Bellini vanishes under mysterious circumstances." Holmes turned toward the mantelpiece and retrieved a faded concert program from the sheaf of documents Bellini had initially sent us. He unfolded it slowly. "The Queen's Hall performance last month," he said. "Bellini was the principal violinist in a program that included Ravel's Tizzy Gain and a new piece by a young composer named Elliot Haraway sponsored. According to the notes here by Travers himself." I sat up. So Travers was not merely in attendance. He had influence over the event? Holmes tapped the program. "Precisely. The concert served as a reunion of sorts, Travers re-establishing his musical relevance, Violin reaffirming his place at the pinnacle of performance. An uncomfortable collision of past and present." He crossed the room in swift strides, retrieving his violin from its case. As he tuned it absently, he spoke with growing intensity. "Watson, we are no longer investigating a simple disappearance. This is a battle of legacies. The ghosts of a competitive past have stirred to life, and Bellini may have paid the price." "Then our course is clear," I said. "We must speak with Travers." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Indeed, but not directly, not yet. First, we observe." The following evening found us seated in the upper balcony of Queen's Hall. The Royal Society of Virtuosi was hosting a commemorative recital, ostensibly in honor of retired maestro Charles Dempsey. But Holmes suspected otherwise. "This gathering," he murmured, scanning the crowd below through his opera glasses, "will draw every major figure of London's classical circle, including, I suspect, our elusive Mr. Travers." The hall was a masterpiece of acoustics and architecture, its domed ceiling adorned with allegorical frescoes, its seating plush and crimson. The audience shimmered with silk, medals, and polished canes, and yet a tension hung in the air like an unresolved chord. The recital began with a duet for piano and viola. While the music filled the room, Holmes remained fixated on the leftmost section of the audience, where a man with snowy white hair and a distinguished air sat flanked by two younger musicians. "There," Holmes whispered. "Third row from the stage. That is Milo Travers." I followed his gaze. The man's posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. He clapped only perfunctorily at the conclusion of each piece. Between movements, Holmes leaned closer. "Observe the seating chart I acquired," he said, producing a folded paper from his coat. "Those chairs were reserved for committee members. Travers now sits among them. His name, absent from programs for nearly a decade, has returned to prominence. And yet, I noted, he does not seem pleased." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Because something remains unfinished. Tonight may be a celebration on paper, but I suspect it conceals a war of reputations." As the final ensemble took their bows, Holmes rose from his seat. "Now comes the intermission. Follow me, Watson. It is time to strike a chord of our own." We descended to the main lobby, where guests gathered for refreshments under the glittering chandeliers. Trevor stood alone near a window, sipping sherry. Holmes approached with the confidence of an old acquaintance. "Mr. Travers," he said warmly, "a fine performance this evening. You do the virtuosi proud." Travers turned slowly, his gaze sharp. Up close, he was even more imposing, a tall figure in a plum-colored evening coat, with high cheekbones and deeply set eyes that gave the impression of perpetual scrutiny. "I don't believe we've met," he said cautiously. "Sherlock Holmes." Holmes replied, extending a hand. "And this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson." The name struck its mark. Trevor's brow lifted, but his expression remained guarded. "I've read of your exploits," he said, "though I cannot imagine what business brings you to a musical society's gathering. A case involving one of your former rivals," Holmes said without pause. "Signor Luca Bellini." Trevor's mouth tightened. "A name I've not heard spoken in some time." "I find that difficult to believe," Holmes replied, "especially considering the note Bellini played at the Queen's Hall recital last month." "You were in attendance, were you not?" Travers took a slow breath. "I was, though I must admit the performance did not leave much of an impression." Holmes tilted his head. "Not even the peculiarities in Bellini's playing? The subtle delay in his andante phrasing? The tremor in his left hand?" Now Trevor's mask wavered. "You notice that?" "I notice many things, Mr. Travers, including that you sponsored Elliot Haraway's new composition, a role that placed you behind the scenes for much of the evening." Trevor's voice dropped. "What exactly are you implying?" "I imply nothing," Holmes said evenly. "I inquire, because Bellini has vanished, and your reappearance in the musical world coincides too neatly with his disappearance. For a heartbeat, I feared Travers might strike Holmes, but instead he let out a soft, almost rueful laugh. "I see now why you're feared in Parliament and the press alike," he said. "But I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I have done nothing but reclaim what was once mine, my place in the society, my standing among peers." "You've reclaimed it," Holmes said slowly, "by orchestrating a concert that reestablished your name and potentially silenced the one man who could outshine you." Travers met his gaze coolly. "I suggest you find better proof than gossip and shadows." And with that he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in silence. Only once seated again by the fire did he speak. "Watson, we must act quickly. Travers is on edge, and a desperate man is prone to mistakes. You believe he had a hand in Bellini's vanishing?" "I do. But the proof eludes us still. One missing piece." Just then there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding an envelope. "This arrived by courier," she said. Handing it to Holmes. He opened it. Inside was a single scrap of parchment. Upon it, in flowing ink, were 4 notes written in musical notation. Beneath them a cryptic message. "Midnight. The bell tower." Come alone. Holmes stared at it for a long time. "The final movement begins," he said quietly, "and the crescendo awaits." Section: "The bell tower at midnight." The message, as cryptic as it was evocative, sat upon our table like a summons from the grave. 4 notes written in neat musical notation, E, F, D repeated like a haunting motif in Holmes's mind as he sat staring into the hearth. Outside, the fog clung low to the cobbles of Baker Street, and the hour— "Yes," the figure replied, in a voice taut with nerves. I had no other choice. The speaker stepped into the sliver of moonlight, revealing not Milo Travers, as Holmes had expected, but a woman, mid-30s, elegantly dressed, despite the cold her features concealed beneath a dark veil. Holmes's brow furrowed. "You are not whom I anticipated." The woman lifted her veil. "My name is Arabella Vance. I'm a singer, I should say, until 2 years ago. You won't find my name on any program since then. Why summon me now? I've remained silent far too long," she said, wringing her gloved hands. "You're looking for Violin. I can help you. But first you must understand, ... She turned away briefly, gathering herself, then spoke quickly, as though fearful that courage might fail her. "Milo Travers is dangerous. He hides it well, but he's capable of terrible things. I know this because he tried to silence me twice. The second time was nearly fatal." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because I saw what he did to Bellini." Holmes stepped forward. "And tell me." Arabella nodded. "It was after the Queen's Hall recital. I'd stayed late to speak with Bellini. He and I had worked together once, and I hoped he might recommend me for a revival of Faust. I was waiting in the hallway behind the stage. Travers arrived first. I thought he hadn't seen me." Her voice dropped. "But I saw everything. The argument. Travers accused him of stealing his legacy. Said he would end the line of the so-called musical gods who humiliated him. Bellini tried to leave. Travers stopped him. There was a struggle. Then Travers produced a syringe. He injected Bellini with something. Bellini collapsed. Travers dragged him away." Holmes was utterly still. "You're certain?" "I swear it. I tried to follow, but I heard footsteps, so I hid. I never saw Bellini again, but I know Travers took him. I tried to go to the police, but they dismissed me. Said I was hysterical or drunk. Then someone pushed me from the theater balcony 2 nights later. I survived barely. I've lived in fear since. Why speak now? Because Travers grows bolder. He believes no one suspects him, but I heard he's planning something more, another disappearance. Another rival, perhaps. And you were asking questions. I thought, if anyone could stop him, it would be you." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a notebook. "Describe everything, dates, names, anything that could help us verify your account." Arabella did so, her voice trembling but steady. "When she finished, Holmes gently closed the book. "You had done a brave thing," he said softly. "I will ensure your safety." Arabella nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, he must be stopped." Holmes turned toward the stairs. "We begin tonight." Minutes later, Holmes emerged from the church. I joined him at once, and he relayed Arabella's testimony in a low voice as we walked briskly toward the cab stand. "We now have motive, means, and witness," he said. "Travers used a sedative, likely scopolamine, given the paralysis. Bellini was taken from the theater. Now the question becomes, where and why keep him alive?" I asked. "Why not kill him if he truly hated him so?" "Ah," Holmes said with a glint in his eye, "because Travers is not merely vengeful. He is theatrical. He wants to demonstrate his supremacy to break Bellini publicly, then triumph in his place. That's why he's arranged a private salon performance this coming week, with a new piece he claims is his magnum opus. It will not be him performing. However, you think yes, Watson? I believe Bellini will be the centerpiece. Broken, drugged, a shadow of his former self paraded like a ghost. We stopped at the cab. Holmes turned to me, his voice cold with resolve. We end this. Now. Section. Beneath the crescendos it was the following afternoon, and the sky above London had turned a dull pewter hue, with clouds thick and unyielding, threatening rain that never quite fell. Holmes stood by the window of our sitting room. At Baker Street, his violin tucked beneath his chin, bow suspended mid-air as he mused aloud between phrases of some unfamiliar fugue. Each drawn note seemed to parallel the tension coiling tighter with every hour. The problem, Watson, he said at last, lowering the instrument, is not Trevor's guilt, of which I am now convinced, but how to prove it beyond the reach of reasonable doubt. I looked up from the notes Arabella had provided the night before, scattered across the table. Arabella Vance's testimony is damning, but without Bellini himself or physical evidence, precisely. The law cannot prosecute shadows, Holmes replied, striding across the room to retrieve his monograph on sedatives. Trevor's is clever, brilliant, even, and like all narcissists, he's vain enough to perform one final act of cruelty in the most public manner possible. That salon concert he is planning, it will be the climax of his twisted performance. He turned the pages with precision, then tapped one with satisfaction. Scopolamine, he murmured. An alkaloid derived from nightshade, dulls the senses, removes willpower. But with precise dosage, the victim retains some mobility, even memory, yet becomes malleable. Our Bellini would be no more than a puppet. And how do we stop it? I asked. We can't accuse Trevor's in the absence of Bellini. We find him, Holmes said simply. But where could he be? Trevor's has no known estate. No. Known estate, no. But he does have patrons. Holmes turned, now fully animated. He may loathe the musical establishment, but he never fully severed ties with its eccentric supporters. One in particular, Sir Crispin Vale, has hosted Trevor's in recent months. A reclusive gentleman who resides at Silchester House, a country manor well outside the city. I frowned. That name seems familiar. It should. Vale is notorious for funding extravagant and often controversial musical experiments. He once commissioned an opera performed entirely by trained parrots. If Trevor's needed a secluded place for his preparations, Silchester would offer ideal privacy and resources. Within the hour we were bundled in thick wool coats and aboard. A train bound for Hampshire, the city receding behind veils of fog and soot. Holmes sat opposite me, reading silently, though his fingers tapped a quiet rhythm upon the armrest. A, E, F, D dot, as the countryside blurred past. I could not help but ask, Holmes ... You said something last night about Trevor's not wishing to kill Bellini, but to humiliate him. Do you truly believe he intends to place him on stage in that condition? Holmes's expression darkened. I do. For men like Trevor's, triumph is not complete unless their enemy lives to witness it. But I suspect there is more. Something deeper. His so-called masterpiece may be more than a composition. He turned to the window, his reflection looking back in shards of light. "I believe the performance itself is the crime." Silchester House rose like a brooding fortress from the moors, all gray stone and tall chimneys, its windows glinting like half-lidded eyes. We arrived near dusk, the last rays of sunlight slicing through the hedges as a butler admitted us, clearly under instructions. "Sir Crispin is not receiving visitors," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "However, Mr. Travers is at present rehearsing in the gallery." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then handed the butler a sealed card embossed with a wax seal. "Would you kindly inform him that this note is from Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard? We're here under pressing legal inquiry." That was not entirely true, of course, but the impression worked. The butler's lips thinned. "One moment, gentlemen." While he disappeared into the depths of the house, Holmes and I remained. In the vestibule, our eyes sweeping the grand interior. The manor was a hybrid of eras: classical columns near the front entrance, Tudor gables in the rear, and a sweeping staircase that led to a balcony above where soft, wavering notes could be heard, violin music, distorted and slow, as if the player struggled to follow the rhythm. "That," Holmes whispered, "is not Travers." Before I could reply, a door opened and the butler returned. "Mr. Travers says you may join him. The gallery is up the stairs, second left." We followed. The corridor into the bowels of Silchester House, where the air grew colder and the walls bore faded portraits of long-deceased gentry. Eventually we reached a door from behind which the music spilled, a strange staccato melody, bent out of shape by uneven tempo. Holmes paused, listening. "Violin was a master of tempo rubato," he said. "But this is like watching a marionette perform ballet." He opened the door. The music ceased. Inside stood a chamber lit by tall candelabras, their wax gutters long. At the center of the room was a music stand, and behind it, seated upon a cushioned chair, was a man with hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and tremulous fingers still clutching a bow. Giovanni Bellini. He looked up, and though recognition flickered, in his eyes there was no spark, only an eerie vacancy. "Bellini?" I breathed. Holmes moved forward slowly, examining the man as a physician might examine a patient. Bellini's breathing was shallow. His limbs moved like he was under water. "He's drugged," Holmes said, "but conscious. The dose is wearing off." A sound behind us caused both of us to turn sharply. Travers stood in the doorway, elegant as ever, clad in a high-collared velvet coat. His eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. Holmes's expression was unreadable. He played a long game, carefully escalating the doses of chloral hydrate until Bellini was docile, but not entirely incoherent. He mimicked the patterns of breakdown failing to show up at rehearsals, cryptic messages so that Bellini would be presumed lost to madness. But even I underestimated the level of depravity he reached in attempting to usurp the man's very creativity. He rose and crossed to the escritoire, where the reconstructed sonata lay spread out on crisp parchment. I followed, glancing down. At the flowing notations, the familiar minor modulations, so distinctive of Bellini's touch, though interspersed with dissonant themes foreign to his style. He copied Bellini's work? I asked. No, Holmes corrected softly. He harvested it. Fragments murmured in stupor. Half-formed melodies, spilled from a fractured mind and caught like butterflies in Travers's net. He wove them together to form a piece he could call his own a grotesque pastiche. As I stared at the notes, the full weight of the deception struck me. This was not simply theft. It was parasitism, and he would have had Bellini perform it, I said, before an audience who believed him mad. To destroy him, not only in soul, but in reputation. Holmes gave a single nod. The ultimate humiliation. A masterpiece Bellini. Didn't remember a composing full of errors, mockery, and decline performed by a man too damaged to protest. A week later, Holmes surprised me by agreeing to a visit to the hospital where Bellini was recovering. The gesture seemed out of character. He preferred resolutions to be neat, final, but something in this case lingered beneath his usual detachment. Violin was propped against a wall of pillows, pallid but alert, the hollows of his cheeks less severe than they'd been. He blinked at our arrival and slowly smiled. Dr. Watson and Mr. Holmes. "You're looking stronger," I said, genuinely encouraged by the improvement. "They tell me you've been able to hold a bow again." Bellini chuckled weakly, with the elegance of a butcher, but yes. His eyes moved to Holmes. "They also say I owe my life to a detective with no love for music." Holmes tilted his head. "I dislike imprecision, Signor, but I detest waste even more, and your genius was nearly obliterated by a charlatan with delusions of grandeur." Bellini regarded him, his expression darkening. "He made me doubt myself, made me believe I had gone mad. For days I couldn't distinguish dream from waking. Every time I tried to think, to remember ... there was fog. And in that fog, a voice whispering what a failure I had become." Holmes stepped forward and sat beside the bed. "But you are not mad, and the fog has lifted, has it?" Bellini asked softly. "What if the music doesn't return? What if he took something I can't retrieve?" "Then write new music," Holmes said with sudden firmness. "Not to prove something to others, but to reclaim yourself. That's the revenge Trevor's never anticipated. Recovery." The words struck the maestro visibly. A tear escaped the corner of his eye. "I never wanted revenge," he whispered. Only silence. "You shall have peace," Holmes replied. "But one day, perhaps sooner than you think, I would like to hear you play again. Not the Bellini Trevor's tried to destroy, the real one." That evening, the two of us returned to Baker Street in a pensive mood. Holmes took down his own violin and began playing softly, hesitant at first, then with confidence. It was Bellini's prelude. Not perfect, but heartfelt. I sat with a tumbler of brandy, watching him in silence. Holmes rarely played others' work unless it fascinated him or moved him deeply. Tonight I sensed it was both. "You played well," I said when he finished. He raised an eyebrow. "I played adequately, but I am no Bellini." "No," I agreed. "You are Holmes, and sometimes I wonder which of you understands human nature better." He looked away, uncharacteristically touched, then smirked. "Let us not dwell in sentiment, Watson. There are always more puzzles to solve." "But fewer that matter," I said quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed the violin back into its case, locked it, and stood. "Justice," he said, "isn't the verdict. It's the echo, and tonight it plays in tune." Section. The veiled Encore London's winter twilight arrived with an uncanny haste that week, creeping through the streets like an old thief familiar with every alley. Snow had begun to fall, soft, insistent, and the gas lights flickered behind the haze like weary sentinels. I sat by the fire in our Baker Street rooms, finishing the final lines of my journal entry concerning the case of Signor Bellini. Holmes, as ever, was restless. He moved to and fro between the window and fireplace, his brows furrowed in thought, his lean figure wrapped in a dressing gown of dark velvet. His pipe had long since burned out, but he continued to draw from it absent-mindedly. I could tell he was brooding, though the bulk of the case had concluded with Trevor's arrest. Something still gnawed at him. "You've reread Trevor's confession twice," I said, laying down my pen. "Either it lacks something, or you do?" "Both," Holmes replied shortly. He tossed the confession on the table between us. "It is too eloquent, too composed for a man whose schemes have just unraveled. Trevor's is guilty, Watson, but I began to think he was not the architect of this madness." I leaned forward. "But you told Inspector Gregson that the composition, the Sonnet Fantôme, was pieced together from fragments Bellini spoke in a drugged state, that Trevor's compiled it to pass it off as his own." "He did." Holmes stood. "But now I wonder if someone else guided his hand, someone who wanted the scandal more than the success." I frowned. "You suspect an accomplice?" Holmes nodded, his gray eyes sharp with conviction. "Or perhaps a conductor behind the orchestra." He walked briskly to his files and began leafing through clippings and letters. "Do you recall the note Bellini received the day before his disappearance? The one delivered by a courier boy outside the Lyceum?" "Of course," I replied. "It said only midnight. The bell shall toll. Come alone. You believed it was a lure?" "I did," Holmes murmured. "But Bellini mentioned that he recognized the handwriting, believed it belonged to someone connected to his conservatoire days. I brushed it aside, assuming Trevor's forged it. But now I am not so certain." He pulled a letter from a file and handed it to me. "Read this." It was from Professor Edwin Charpentier, former director at the Paris Conservatoire. I scanned it. The letter was dated nearly 6 months prior and congratulated Bellini on his performance at the Queen's Jubilee. Near the end, a phrase caught my eye. "Your success, though well-earned, has perhaps come at a price to others. Talent, when plucked too early, leaves the vine bare for those still growing." I looked up. Holmes gave a curt nod, a veiled resentment. Charpentier was once Bellini's mentor, some say his champion, but he retired under somewhat clouded circumstances. Whispers of favoritism, misallocated funds, and an uncomfortable fall from grace. "And you believe he may be involved?" I asked. "Consider this," Holmes said. "Trevor studied briefly at the same conservatoire. He never achieved Bellini's brilliance, but was known for his mimicry. What if Charpentier saw in Trevor's a chance to revive his influence, to unmake Bellini's legacy as a form of revenge or redemption?" I exhaled. "A man like Charpentier would know precisely how to break a musician, not through violence, but dissonance." Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely. And such a man would never expose himself by acting directly. He would need a vessel, an ambitious pupil, eager for fame and embittered by obscurity." We sat in silence. For a moment, the implications settling like fresh snow. Then Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Watson, fetch your coat." "Now?" I exclaimed. "It's snowing and nearly midnight." "Exactly," Holmes said, already pulling on his greatcoat. "Midnight seems to be the theme of this symphony, and we must hear its final movement." We arrived at the modest townhouse in Bloomsbury with the sleet still nipping at our heels. Holmes rapped the brass knocker with his usual purpose. The house was unassuming, too unassuming for a man once renowned in the highest musical circles of Europe. A servant opened the door, surprised to find two gentlemen at such an hour. "Professor Charpentier," Holmes said smoothly, "will want to see us. We are here on behalf of Signor Bellini." That name alone seemed to strike a note of alarm. The servant hesitated, then ushered us inside. The drawing-room was lit by a single lamp, its shade stained amber. Books lined the shelves in careful order, but the rest of the room felt staged. No clutter, no music. A silent museum of a man who once loved sound. Professor Edwin Charpentier emerged moments later, a tall, lean man in his early 60s with a hawkish nose and tightly clipped beard. He wore a robe of deep maroon and regarded us with a forced cordiality. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this nocturnal intrusion?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "We come bearing questions, Professor, and an invitation to confess your role in the attempted ruin of your former student." Charpentier's eyes narrowed, though he betrayed no alarm. "You speak boldly." "Sir, I speak precisely," Holmes replied. "You mentored both Bellini and Travers. One became a sensation, the other a failure. You retired in scandal while Bellini soared. That must have wounded your pride." Charpentier's lips tightened. "And then Travers returned to your orbit," Holmes continued. "You saw in him an echo of your own bitterness. You fed his delusions, perhaps even supplied the sedatives, the strategy encouraging him to harvest Bellini's mind while his body lay drugged. You taught him to orchestrate not music, but a farce." The professor folded his hands behind his back. Sherlock Holmes and the Vanishing Violinist section. The gas lamps lining the mist-veiled streets of Kensington flickered against the creeping dusk as Holmes and I stepped once more from our hansom cab and crossed the wrought iron gate into the garden square where Bartholomew Wetherell's house loomed with stiff Edwardian grandeur. The clouds above rolled thick and low, smothering the city in an oppressive gray that pressed upon the senses and seemed to mirror the complexity of the case unfolding before us. Holmes had grown increasingly introspective since our visit to Herr Reinhardt's shop and the encounter with the terrified apprentice. Though he remained silent for much of our journey, I knew from experience that his mind was grinding ceaselessly through each strand of the puzzle, seeking the single loose thread that would unravel it all. "I have always maintained," Holmes muttered at last as we approached Wetherell's front steps, "that the most subtle of mysteries tend to be laced with the most banal of motives. But when art enters the equation, true artistry, it tends to confound the ordinary with the extraordinary." "Do you believe this truly to be about the violin?" I asked. "Or has that merely been the cloak draped over something else entirely?" Holmes gave no answer, but his thin lips curved in a smile that hinted at something coalescing behind those ever-calculating eyes. Wetherell himself received us, his face lined with fresh worry. "You've returned just in time," he whispered, ushering you swiftly inside. "Something most peculiar has occurred." He led us through to his study, where a white-gloved inspector stood stiffly beside a sideboard upon which a decanter of brandy sat half-drained. The room, I noticed immediately, was darker than before. The curtains were drawn tight, and only A single lamp cast a cone of yellow light across the Persian rug. A letter arrived not an hour ago, Wetherell said, his voice low. No signature, no address, only this. He handed Holmes a sheet of thick ivory paper. I leaned close to read it over his shoulder. You search for what cannot be possessed. The song belongs not to the hand, but to the soul. Seek her voice, and the silence will end. Holmes read it twice, eyes narrowing as he folded it delicately and tucked it into his coat pocket. The phrasing, he murmured, is familiar. It bears the melodramatic cadence of someone well acquainted with poetic affectation. Whoever wrote this wishes to mislead us or perhaps to awaken a memory. The inspector cleared his throat. No forced entry. Nothing stolen. But we did find this. He opened a velvet-lined violin case on the desk. Holmes's eyes lit with intensity. The Stradivarius? No, sir, a forgery. Good enough to fool a merchant at a glance, but not under scrutiny. Holmes examined the instrument with gloved hands, his fingers tracing the scroll and bridge. This was meant to be found, he said, and not by Wetherell, by me. I frowned. Why leave a decoy? To satisfy a deadline, Holmes replied. Whoever took the real instrument knew we were closing in. This, he gestured to the fake, is a diversion. He turned to Wetherell. Have you had any unusual visitors since we left? Wetherell paled. A young woman came yesterday. Said she was from the Charity Commission. Spoke at length about funding for the arts. I thought little of it. Holmes raised a brow. Did she see the instrument? Yes. I had the case open on the drawing-room table. She admired it with, he hesitated, a kind of reverence. I assumed she was an enthusiast. Holmes's expression shifted subtly, but enough that I recognized a spark of recognition. He turned sharply. Did she speak of music? Of the violin's tone? She said, yes, she said it had a voice that transcended time. Holmes exhaled. She's not from any charity. That was Charlotte Bellamy. I blinked. The soprano? Not quite. Her twin sister, Eliza. Less known, but a far more enigmatic figure. She was once engaged to Herr Reinhardt. Wetherell looked thunderstruck. But she disappeared years ago. Holmes nodded. Indeed, after Reinhardt's accident and the death of his protégé, it seems she has returned. The pieces at last began to click into place. Then she must be the one behind the notes, the stolen violin. All of it, I said. Holmes tapped his fingers together, thoughtful. Not necessarily the thief, but the key to its location? Most. Certainly. Suddenly a sharp rapping came at the front door. A servant hurried in moments later, announcing that a Miss Eliza Bellamy was requesting an audience with Mr. Holmes. We exchanged looks of surprise, but Holmes simply straightened his jacket. Show her in. Eliza entered like a wraith from the past, draped in black velvet, her gloved hands folded delicately before her, and her eyes gray and depthless, holding a quiet power. Mr. Holmes, she said with a slight curtsy. Dr. Watson, I trust I have not intruded? Holmes offered her the chair nearest the fireplace. Not at all. I was just speaking of you. She smiled faintly. I had hoped you would deduce my involvement before others did. You left quite a trail, Holmes said. Though it was artfully disguised, her gaze dropped to the violin case. I see the phantom has played its role. Where is the real one? Holmes asked gently. In a place that can no longer be silenced, she said cryptically. But you will need to follow its song to find it. Holmes leaned forward. The bell that rang at midnight, he said. You know what it means, don't you? She nodded. It is not just a title. It's a place and a time. Go to the old bell tower at the chapel on Ravenshire Lane. At midnight its chime reveals the truth. Before we could press further, she rose, and with eerie calm excused herself. Do not follow me now, she said. Follow the music. And with that, she vanished into the evening mist. Holmes stood motionless for a moment. Then he turned to me with sharp resolve. Watson, fetch your coat. We have a rendezvous with a ghost and a bell that does not ring for the living. And with that we stepped once more into the gathering fog. Final section. The Midnight Chime, expanded version. The chapel on Ravenshire Lane stood like a mausoleum to forgotten faith. Its ancient stones were etched with the scars of centuries' grooves, where rain had etched its own script. Corners smoothed by wind and time. Ivy strangled the walls, its creeping tendrils wrapping like fingers around the buttresses, as if trying to reclaim the structure for the earth. The crooked steeple jutted skyward, defying gravity in its stubborn tilt, and high above, framed against a bruised and starless sky, loomed the silhouette of the great iron bell silent for years. A damp wind swept through the old graveyard, whistling between the leaning tombstones like a ghostly hymn. It carried with it the scent of rain-soaked stone, decaying leaves, and a hint of smoke perhaps from distant hearths still burning. Against the chill of London's midnight dot we approached with deliberate care, our boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the chapel doors. Holmes was several paces ahead of me, his tall figure etched in stark relief against the gloom. His long coat flared behind him in the wind, the collar turned up to his ears, his deerstalker pulled low. For hours now he had said little, his thoughts clearly fixed on some unseen conclusion. The air around him crackled, not just with the weather, but with the palpable tension of a mind nearing the precipice of revelation. He paused before the door's massive oak planks, weathered and moss-lined, secured by rusting iron hinges. With a faint creak, he pushed them inward. They gave way easily, the sound echoing through the hollow stone chamber, like a groan from the underworld inside. The nave was bathed in dim moonlight that filtered through broken, stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the cold flagstones. Dust motes danced in the beam of our lantern as we stepped over the threshold. Pews lined the aisle in silent, orderly rows, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of worshippers. A thin layer of dust covered everything, yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as though waiting for something to begin. It's a strange thing, Holmes murmured beside me, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. That in the end all things sacred and profane gather under the same roof. I turned toward him. And what do we expect to find here? The answer, he replied, without further explanation. He led the way toward the rear of the chapel, where a narrow stone staircase spiraled upward into the tower. The air grew colder as we ascended, the chill of stone closing in. Our lantern flickered against damp walls etched with graffiti and names carved by choir boys and scoundrels alike. Over the centuries, When we emerged into the belfry, we found ourselves surrounded by the shadows of Gothic arches, their shapes half lost in fog. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight as we stepped onto the narrow platform. Above us loomed the iron bell, mottled with rust, hanging silent and monolithic. Beyond, the London skyline stretched into darkness barely visible through the mist, save for the orange halos of distant gas lamps. Holmes stepped toward the coiled bell rope that hung beside the wall. He laid a hand upon it and stood still. From his expression I could tell that the case, the theft, the lies, the disappearances was nearing its culmination dot at the stroke of midnight. He pulled once, firmly. The bell rang out with a deep, solemn resonance, a sound that vibrated through our very bones. It rolled outward into the night like a wave of memory, awakening the slumbering district and stirring the shadows. Then faint, elusive, a sound rose from below. Delicate, melancholic, unmistakably a violin. The notes floated upward through the stone shaft, like incense light and sorrowful, yet strangely exultant. It was not merely music. It was mourning given voice, longing transformed into sound. It winged through the chapel like a spirit revisiting its sanctuary. Holmes turned sharply toward the stairs, and without a word we descended. The music grew louder with each step. At the foot of the altar, awash in the gentle light of the rose window, stood a lone figure in black. Her silhouette trembled with each note. In her hands gleamed the missing Stradivarius, its polished surface catching the light like fire through amber dot Eliza Bellamy. She played as if communing with another world, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, fingers moving with breathtaking precision. The music trembled through the chamber, filling every pew, every crack in the stone, every breath in my lungs. It was a requiem, a confession, a farewell. When the final note faded into the vaulted silence, she slowly opened her eyes. "You came," she whispered. Holmes stepped forward, his voice as steady as ever. "And so did you, Miss Bellamy, or should I say Mrs. Reinhardt?" A shadow passed over her expression, not of guilt, but of resignation. "You see everything?" "Not everything," Holmes admitted, "but enough. You never left London. You orchestrated your disappearance to protect what could not be bought or sold." She nodded. "My husband's final work, that violin, it was not just an instrument. It was the culmination of his life, his grief, his genius. When he died, I couldn't bear to watch it become a collector's trophy, so I made it vanish." Holmes gestured subtly toward the shadows. "And the notes you left behind, each a riddle, a trail of breadcrumbs?" "A composition," she said. "A final piece, his requiem." "And the performance tonight?" I asked, stepping beside Holmes. Eliza looked toward the rose window, her face illuminated by the moonlight. He always said the instrument should be heard in a place where ambition could not reach it. I chose this chapel for its silence, for the peace it offers the dead. Holmes approached, his footsteps soundless on the stone. "You played as if saying goodbye." "I was," she said, and offered the violin to him. He hesitated. "You would relinquish it?" She smiled softly. "I was only its guardian. I've carried it long enough." Holmes accepted the instrument with unusual reverence. For a long moment he merely looked at it, as though reading the soul of its maker through its varnished wood. "There's still the matter of the law," I said quietly, but Holmes shook his head. "The law is not blind, Watson, and neither is justice. We left the chapel together under the fading chime of midnight. The night had grown still, the wind abating, the sky clearing to reveal scattered stars. In the distance, the first hints of dawn painted the horizon with a cool silver. The next morning we returned the violin to Charles Wetherell, whose bluster had given way to solemn understanding. Holmes insisted that the instrument not be sold, but preserved its legacy honored, not profited from. Wetherell, chastened, agreed that, as for Eliza Bellamy, she disappeared once more. No warrants were issued, no statements given. She had told her truth in the only way she could. That evening at Baker Street, we sat by the fire in uncharacteristic silence. Holmes rested the Stradivarius upon its stand, yet made no move to play it. "You let her go," I finally said. Holmes did not meet my gaze. "She wasn't a thief, only a widow mourning in her own tongue." I nodded slowly. Music at midnight, a fitting epitaph. Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. The tendrils of smoke curled upward like phantom notes. "Sometimes, Watson," he said softly, "truth must be heard, not spoken. And sometimes justice lies not in what is taken, but in what is preserved." I opened my journal, pen poised. There would be much to record, though some parts, perhaps the most important, would remain unwritten. The vanishing violinist had played her final note, and Sherlock Holmes, in his unyielding logic and rare compassion, had shown me once more that beneath his sharp edges beat a heart disguised but indelibly human.